Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this final in our lecture series, a collaboration between the British Association for Local History and the Historic Towns Trust. My name is Paul Driver, as many of you will know, and this evening, rather than joining you from West London, I'm joining you from Lincolnshire, land of the free, home of the brave. Do let us know in the chat where you're joining us from this evening. I always love to know how wide our audience is, where you're joining us from. Just a quick note that, as I say, this is the final in our series, and we hope very much that we will be able to make all of the recordings available, not just for the next couple of days, but actually on the YouTube channel of the Historic Towns Trust later in the year, hopefully fairly soon. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Vanessa Harding, Chair of the Historic Towns Trust, who's going to host this evening's lecture. I just want to thank Vanessa and everybody at the Historic Towns Trust for their collaboration in this year's series. So that's all from me this evening, and hope you enjoyed tonight's lecture. Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. And I'd like to say how much we value this association with the British Association for Local History. As Paul said, this is the last in this year's series, but we certainly hope we're going to go on doing this. In this series, we've been bringing together lectures from people who have contributed to or who plan to collaborate on publications, or indeed those who are taking further something from the maps and atlases that we've already produced. And Stephanie Brown, our speaker tonight, is in the third of these categories. Stephanie's been involved in the Medival Murder Maps project, which has given us, I think, our largest number of hits and largest attention to our maps when their website was launched last autumn. So we're always very pleased to see what people can do with our maps, and this is one of the most interesting and original and very striking developments. So Stephanie was originally working at Cambridge in the Department of Criminology. She's currently at Warwick, but next academic year, she'll be moving to Hull, which of course we heard about last week. She's going to be talking about how the maps can be used to track, to locate, to pin down murders and particularly violent murders using the maps of London, medieval York and medieval Oxford. But she's going to tell you about that herself. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak here tonight. I'm very excited to share with you what we've been working on at the Medival Murder Map. So tonight, my talk is going to sort of take two parts. I'm going to start off telling you a little bit about the Medival Murder Map project. I'm going to introduce you to the maps. I'm going to introduce you to the coroner, the coroner's roles are what we use for the maps, and talk to you a little bit about the data behind the maps. And then in the second part of tonight's talk, I'm going to turn more to focusing on gender and thinking about female-perpetrated murder and what we can say about women in the Middle Ages and women and crime using the coroner's rolls and the medieval murder maps. So for the project, we are absolutely indebted to the Historic Towns Trust. Without their beautiful maps, we would not have been able to build our website, the medievalmurdermap.co.uk. I'm going to be showing you some stills of the maps in a little bit, but if you haven't already, I do encourage you in your own time to go and visit the Murder Map website and to have a look at it for yourselves. So we, as Vanessa said, have used 3 maps: London, Oxford and York. And the Historic Towns Trust maps were instrumental in us putting this project together. These are authoritative historic maps of medieval towns put together to the highest scientific standards. If you're not already familiar with these maps in their own right, please do go and have a look at them. They show the locations of city walls, gates, how land was used, the locations of markets. They give you street names, which may have changed over the centuries, buildings that may no longer be there, religious buildings, prominent civic buildings, and all sorts of infrastructure connected to medieval trade. So this is what the data that we used for the maps. So for London, we have 9 years of records, spanning roughly from the year 1300 to the year 1339 to 1340. Within this time period, within these rolls, there are 147 murders. And then York, we have a period of 40 years for the latter half of the 14th century. And in this period, we have 139 murders. And the Oxford data comes from 21 years of records, spanning from the end of the 13th century through to the middle of the 14th century. And in these years, there are 77 homicides. So I just want to put this up to make it clear to you that we're not dealing with completely equal time periods or even completely equal numbers of homicides. They vary. And a lot of this is based on record survival. So for London, these are the rolls that survive. For Oxford, in this time period, these are the rolls that survive. As you'll see for York, we have a much more continuous run of records. But as you'll see in a moment, the York ones remain unpublished. So they're only available in their original manuscript form. And this is why they haven't been used as much as the ones from London and Oxford. You may have seen other people using these. So although we just have 9 years of rolls for London, this actually gives us the most murders within the project. And this is not because London was disproportionately violent, but as you probably have already spotted from the bottom 2 lines of this table, London is the largest town and has by far the largest population. So just 9 years will give us far more cases than 40 years of York or 21 years from Oxford. So this is a taste of what the maps look like. This is the map from London. And as I said, do feel free to go onto the website and look at it in your own time. You'll be able to zoom in and out and click on the cases, and you'll be able to read through each one of the cases. And it'll probably look a lot clearer than this screenshot does at the moment. But I just want to sort of guide you through it and introduce you to the maps. So hopefully what you can see is a map of London. This is the Historic Towns Trust map. And you'll see some pins all over the map. So these pins, each of them represents a homicide case. You'll see that there are different icons. Whether you can see this clearly or not on the PowerPoint, but if you go onto the website and zoom in, you'll be able to see that each of these icons is a weapon, and this represents the weapon that was used in that homicide. So you'll see a hand or a fist, indicating that the murder was conducted with sort of physical force or strength, that no object was used. You'll also see swords, knives, and axes, among many other weapons. The other thing that you may notice just by looking at the map is that some of the pins are blue and some of the pins are red. The blue ones are cases that only involve men, and the red ones are cases that involve men and women. And these red ones are the cases that I'm going to talk more about in the second part of the talk today. So we chose London because I alluded to that a lot of the coroner's rolls have already been published. They've been transcribed, translated, and are available in printed form. So they're very accessible. They can be quickly put into a database. When you're looking at the website, if you click on each one of those pins, it will bring up a transcript or a summary of each of the cases. You can read what happened in each of those cases. So as you can imagine, it was much, much quicker for us to do that with a typed text. All we had to do there was to modernize it and adapt it and make it more readable and remove some of the sort of clunky medieval legal jargon. London also was an obvious place to start because it's the capital, it's the most important city, and due to its scale, it has a lot of data. Then our second map, we decided that we wanted to look at medieval York from the late 14th century. And this is the one I get asked about more often than not. People are sort of quite ready to understand why we chose to look at London, even why we chose to look at Oxford. But people are more curious about why York. And York has probably fallen from grace in latter centuries. But if you think back to the late Middle Ages, particularly in the 14th century, some people have said that York was even sort of a second capital. It was the second richest city in England. It was second only to London in many ways and was really, really important in the first half of the 13th century when England was at war with Scotland. The king often stationed in York, the royal court was often stationed in York, and it was used as a really important military base. York at this time was also the centre of the English textile trade, and we can get a sense of this from looking at the coroner's rolls due to the occupations of the people who were indicted for committing a murder or named as being a victim. Many of these people have occupations connected to textiles. So York is a real sort of industrial centre in this period, the second largest, the second richest city in the kingdom. So a very important city within the time period to look at. And our third and final map is Oxford. And we wanted to pick Oxford to give us something different. So in London, we've got administrators and we've got trades and guilds. In York, we have a lot of the same things on a sort of a smaller scale. But Oxford, we have the university. We have one of the great centres of learning in Northern Europe. So a really, really unique town, giving us a little bit of a different angle on medieval life to perhaps what we would see in the other two places. So this is why it was important for us to include Oxford in the project. So here's how we identified the locations for the map. As you'll see, these are sort of three sections of the coroner's rolls for each of the cities. And you can see by the part underlined that the coroner was often quite meticulous in recording where homicides took place. So in York, we know that it happened in Finkel Street. In Oxford, we know that we're on the High Street. And in London, we're as far as the Church of St. Magnus the Martyr. And using the Historic Towns Trust maps, we've been able to locate where these areas are or would have been. The coroner was interested in recording where the homicide happened for sort of two main reasons. The first is probably sort of an incidental reason that the coroner held an inquest over the body. Nobody was allowed to interfere with a sudden or a suspicious death. No one was allowed to interfere with the body until the coroner arrived and held an inquest. So the inquest was supposed to take place in the location where the homicide had happened. So that it quite often gets recorded in just saying where they've gathered. Another reason that the place can be quite important is because the coroner gathered a jury. And the coroner's jury was drawn from the 4 neighbouring parishes, the 4 neighbouring wards, or if we're in the countryside, the 4 neighbouring villages. So again, it's important to understand where this event took place, so you know which parishes, wards, or villages to draw your jury from. So we're quite lucky in that these are sort of non-formulaic documents. Sometimes the coroner's inquest can give you information, and then you'll go and read the next case expecting to find the same level of detail, and they would have left things out. They're very unstandardized documents, but a lot of the time we do get the location recorded. So this is what the unpublished rolls look like. This is a coroner's inquest from York. This is one case, and this is everything that we have on this murder. There is no other information, as far as I can find, about this case. This short paragraph is everything that survives on this murder. But the rolls of the coroner are really unmatched in value because they capture the first judicial event after a murder was thought to have been committed. The coroner was a royal official. His title, coroner, came from the Latin corona, which means crown. And the office is still familiar to us today. It was the duty of the medieval coroner to investigate all violent, sudden, or suspicious deaths. The coroner summoned a jury, and together they determined the cause, and if necessary, they identified the killer. So if you found a body in late medieval England, it was the duty of the first finder, the person who'd stumbled across the body, to raise the hue and cry, a sort of medieval 999 call, to shout and call for help until word reached the sheriff and or the coroner. After this, the coroner was summoned, would attend the scene and convene a jury. And as we said, the members of a jury were normally drawn from the neighbouring parishes or the neighbouring wards or the neighbouring villages if we're in the countryside. And unlike the modern jury, the coroner's jury were not impartial. On the contrary, they were supposed to be self-informing experts. They were supposed to be knowledgeable of the people and the circumstances involved that led to the death of the victim. So medieval jurors are perhaps closer to expert witnesses rather than modern jury members. So the coroner and the jury conducted an inquest together, a sort of proto-post-mortem over the body in the place that it was found. So coroner's rolls have been used for social history, but it's important for us to remember that they were primarily fiscal or economic records. And there are a couple of reasons why a murder might be profitable for the crown. Firstly, felons' chattels were forfeit to the crown. It was the responsibility of the coroner to assess and value their chattels, and then somebody called the escheator would come and collect them and sell them. So all of their movable goods would be seized and sold. Secondly, the object that caused the death had to be valued and sold. And finally, failure to comply with criminal investigations could result in a fine. And this included, but was not limited to, failing to raise the hue and cry, or removing or moving a body prior to the coroner's inquest. So this is not to say that we can't use these records to study the prosecution of violent crime or to study homicide and criminality. After all, they are full of murders. However, as these are financial sources, they're often not as fruitful as historians would like them to be. And sometimes this can lead to over-speculation to fill gaps led by these sources. So these rolls usually contain details of the suspect and details of the victim. Sometimes we get extra information, like their place of origin for their status. And status for men would be their occupation, and status for women would often be their marital status. In addition, we can get information about the weapons used. And you would have seen from the maps that all of the cases have the weapon used because this was a vital reason for the record being created. We need to know what the weapon was, so it can be seized, valued, and sold, so the Crown can make money from this. Sometimes there's extra information about the injury, the length of time between the wound and the death. The location we've seen is quite often recorded because this was an important part of the record. And quite often we get the chattels or the possessions of the suspect. Sometimes we get a sort of narrative from the jury. Sometimes this can be a longer record than the one on the screen that gives us a little bit of a story. But most of the time, it'll just be odd words that will alert us to how the jury feel about this case, such as saying it was done in malice or saying that it was done in self-defense. These records are so formulaic that even these little words modifying it can really give us a sense whether the jury are trying to mitigate the circumstances or whether they're trying to exacerbate or sensationalize the case. So in isolation, we cannot always glean a lot from these coroners' rolls. However, our knowledge really comes from when we scale them, when we put them all together and we start to look for patterns. We start to engage in what historians would call quantitative history rather than qualitative. So the case that I've got up on the screen is a homicide case from York. It involves a woman called Isabella. And we're told that Isabella is the wife of Nicholas Delwork. Isabella is being indicted for a homicide, and she's being indicted alongside her sister Alice and another man who's called John de Otley. We know that John is working as a bottler in Blake Street in York, but we're not quite sure who John is or how he is connected to Isabella or her sister Alice. We know that in the house of Isabella's husband, it says in the house of Nicholas Delwork, and the previous line has already told us that Isabella is the wife of Nicholas Delwork. In this house, at night, they feloniously kill and murder a priest called Walter. But apart from that, there's not a lot of extra detail in there. Right at the end, we're told that another person called Emma aids and abets this felony. So she is not named as a main suspect, but she's named as an accomplice, we probably say today. So that's just sort of to give you a flavour of how sort of frustrating these records can be on an individual level. We have some people named. We know that they were all in a private residence at night, and the course of that, 3 people plus 1 accomplice have been indicted for the murder of a chaplain. So now I want to turn to think about sex ratios within these records. And a high number of men is a common characteristic in criminal statistics. In criminological studies of long-term violent trends, it has been argued that from the 13th century through to the 20th and even the 21st century, the proportion of female criminals has consistently averaged between 5 to 12%. So although we've seen a colossal decline in violence during this same period, female involvement in crime has been less susceptible to social change. And in the year ending March 2021 in England and Wales, 9% of homicide suspects were women. And if we look at the data from medieval London, this is sort of remarkably similar. We've got sort of 8.2 suspects being identified as being women in 14th century London. So across the project as a whole, around 95% of the suspects were male. However, as you can see, there were significant differences between the three towns. London had substantially higher female offenders compared to York at around 2.5% and Oxford at less than 1%. And the proportion of low female offenders in Oxford may reflect the disproportionately male population of a university town. The highest share of female perpetrators in London compared to York could represent different roles available for medieval women. There may be more opportunities and more freedoms for women working in the nation's capital than other parts of the country. Therefore, they may have more of sort of a public role and find more opportunities to get involved in violent crime. You've got a similar pattern for victims. Female victims are highest in London, lower in York, and very, very small in Oxford. And probably the same things are going on to explain this pattern as well. This probably has more to do with the sort of social, economic, and legal contexts of these three locations. So throughout studies of crime, both today and sort of through the Middle Ages, the early modern period, the Victorian period, there's a male bias in studies of violent crime. And this often means that women have been overlooked in homicide studies. Studies around gender and crime always face challenges of unequal sample sizes. Because men vastly outnumber women, it makes it difficult when trying to draw comparisons. You're inevitably comparing a very large number against a very small number. And I'm going to attempt to mitigate some of this today by using the clergymen as a control group. So the share of clerics is roughly comparable to the share of women appearing in these roles, with some variations, more appearing in Oxford and less appearing in York. But broadly, the number of clerics that appear are roughly in line with what we would expect the clerical population to be. And they are a much smaller number than the laymen who appear in these roles. So I will be referring to the clergy later on to sort of see whether women are forming a different pattern just because there's very small numbers, or whether there are distinct differences. Because of these challenges around comparing a tiny number with a big number, when trying to look at different differences between men and women involved in violent crime, a lot of studies don't even attempt to analyse by gender, treating homicide suspects and statistics as one large group. And then this results in many conclusions about how and when murder happened. However, it is vital to study violent crime and homicide through the lens of gender. The numbers of women are so small that if we remove them from the data, the overall picture would look the same. Therefore, when we fail to analyse by gender, what we're actually doing is universalising the male experience and normalising the male version of violent crime. So there's a couple of ways that I want to look at women. The first of these is going to be the number of suspects. So we know that the coroner and his jury were responsible for naming the suspects. From the case that we saw with Isabella, her sister Alice, this other man called John, and their accomplice, Emma, we know that the coroner and his jury could name more than one suspect. And because we have names, we can then begin to make conclusions about biological sex and make conclusions about gender from there. So all of the cases in this study have been categorized as having sole suspects or co-suspects. A sole suspect is fairly straightforward. This is the jury naming one person that they thought committed the murder. Co-suspects would be like the case that we met earlier. Isabella, her sister Alice, and John, all of them being named as suspects. Therefore, they are categorized as co-suspects. Now, in a study of 13th century England, Charles Buchanan Given argued that one of the most striking features of medieval homicide was its collective character. In opposition, when Sarah Butler looked at spousal homicide in the 14th century, she argued that in 90% of cases where a husband had killed his wife in uxoricides, the husband was the sole suspect. So Butler used Given's earlier conclusion to suggest that uxoricide, wife killing, went against the norm of the collective character of medieval homicide, and inferred that wife slayers were taking on a different dynamic, that they were acting alone, in contrast to the normal pattern. So the Medieval Murder Map project has looked at all different types of homicide, anything that the jury ruled was as a felonious killing, no matter who the victim was. And we also found that most cases had a single suspect. So around 77% of suspects were sole suspect. They were the only person indicted for the killing. This shows that homicide was overwhelmingly prosecuted as a solitary act. However, if we try and break this down by gender, a different picture emerges. So we can see in the first bar, the male suspects, 77% of male suspects were prosecuted alone. And this fits with Butler's conclusion that wife slayers typically acted alone. But perhaps now we can just say that a solitary suspect is characteristic of male homicide more broadly, rather than just wife killings. We can see that even though the clergymen are a much smaller group, they're still following the same pattern as laymen. Most of them were indicted alone. Again, over 70% were thought to be solitary killers. And in the third line, you can see that the difference comes when we look at female suspects. While it's striking that the majority of male, both lay and clerical, were indicted alone, almost 3/4 of women were listed as a co-suspect, so alongside another person. Female suspects present the exact opposite from the male picture. Women were almost twice as likely to be listed as a co-suspect than they were to be named as a sole suspect. And there's also an interesting difference in who they're named alongside. So almost 70% of the women appearing as co-suspects in the coroner's rolls were indicted with members of their family, sisters, their father, and most often alongside their husband or a male lover. In contrast, 80% of the men named as co-suspects, in these cases, there's no clear relationship between them and the person that they were indicted alongside. And I want us to revisit this idea of accomplices. This is the same case that I showed you at the beginning. And towards the end, we're given another name. We're given Emma, who is being named as an accomplice rather than a suspect. She is aiding and abetting, we would say today. She is not being indicted for the murder itself, but rather helping in the felony. But intent-based culpability was a feature of the medieval courtroom. In other words, a person could be prosecuted when they came to jail delivery, when they had the trial at the county jail, for being present during a crime, for knowing about a crime, or assisting in some way. When we move on and look at the trial records, we see around 10% of male and clerical defendants were there because they were accomplices. In contrast, 40% of the women who were tried in relation to homicide were tried as an accomplice rather than a suspect. So not only were women more likely to be a co-suspect, they were also more likely to be an accomplice, performing a sort of auxiliary role to the homicide, assisting rather than committing it themselves. Now, Sarah Butler has suggested that medieval juries may have struggled to believe a woman could commit such a heinous crime on their own. And it is vital to remember these are male-voiced sources recorded in a legal male environment. Therefore, it is possible that the role of women was underplayed due to ideas stemming from traditional gender norms. It is conceivable that the jury were less willing to accept the notion of a sole female killer. There may be a more comprehensive search for a co-suspect when you have a female suspect rather than when you have a sole male suspect. This could be a result of benevolent sexism. It's possible that the jury did not believe or want to believe that women were capable of heinous violence. Of course, it may also reflect, either in whole or in part, the reality of female criminality. Nevertheless, it is striking that the majority of female defendants appear in the subordinate role of an accomplice, even in the case of the killing of their own husband. And it's interesting how historians have interpreted this pattern of female co-suspects and accomplices by saying that it's a sign that women get drawn into male conflicts. Now, this casual removal of female agency does not seem to have a basis in the sources. And again, it is highly questionable when the victim was the woman's own husband. Now, the second thing that I want to analyze is the day of the week on which the homicide took place. This is available in the vast majority of cases, but because the coroner's rolls also record the date on which the killing took place. And that allows us to have the day of the week on which the fatal violence took place. So this is all of the homicides together across all three towns. As you can see immediately, is that almost 1/3 of killings occurred on a Sunday. The remaining days divided relatively equally, 10 to 13% on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and Saturday. Monday at 17% is above the average, and Friday at 6% is below. And this is not necessarily a revolutionary finding. This mirrors Barbara Hannawalt's research on the Northamptonshire coroner's rolls. Hannawalt stated that Sunday was the day of murder in medieval society, and she also concluded that Monday was the second highest day. Now, for pre-modern social historians, this pattern is not surprising. It can be attributed to social factors in medieval society. Sunday was an enforced day of rest, likely filled with drinking, sports, and fights. And it's possible that Sunday arguments or drinking sessions spilled over into Monday. And this speaks to E.P. Thompson's phenomenon of Saint Monday, where work was slower, shorter, and there was more of a holiday feel, perhaps more like the modern Friday. Today in England and Wales, criminal statistics suggest that most murders occur on the weekend, and usually on Saturdays. But this mirrors the medieval picture that you see on the screen. In both of our societies, murder spikes when we have leisure time, when our normal routines are disrupted, when we have free time to move around, to socialize, and to consume alcohol. But this picture gives us all homicides. And as we've seen, the vast majority of these suspects are male. So what about thinking about women? Do we see the same pattern for women? As you can see here, immediately, we do not see the same pattern for female suspects. They are split more evenly across the week, and strikingly, there is no clear majority on Sundays. Now, again, it's vital to bear in mind that we have a small number of female suspects. And because we have a small number, it's always tricky in percentages. If you add a couple of cases on each of the days, the percentage can shift quite drastically. So here we need to rely on the clergy, another small group. Do they follow the male pattern where we see killings taking place on Sundays? Or is it just that we're dealing with a small number of cases and the numbers are too small for us to get at any clear patterns? Here we can see when we look at the clergy in isolation, they are following the male pattern. We're seeing this huge spike on Sundays and an overflow onto Monday, the second highest day being Monday. Now, there are potentially huge implications for both criminology and medieval socio-economic history. From a criminological perspective, it raises the possibility that assumptions about when violence is committed is skewed by the prevalence of male offenders. While most suspects of violent crime are and were male, universalizing the male experience of criminality is still problematic. Everything we think we understand about violence, when it's being done based on data and statistics, is just telling us about male-perpetrated violence. Additionally, this calls for more research into the social and working lives of medieval women. The fact that prosecuted female violence is not concentrated on a Sunday could suggest that women did not follow the working patterns outlined by E.P. Thompson. Perhaps they had a more irregular working pattern. If it's impossible to identify a spike on any other day, it could suggest that female labor was more consistent throughout the week. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the weapons that we see being used. So when I showed you the maps, you could see that each of them had an icon, which was the weapon used in the homicide. And we know that the coroner was responsible for collecting and valuing the weapons. So it was a really important part of the inquest and was almost always recorded. So the most frequent instrument used is sharp weapons, swords, knives, short utility knives. But we can see other weapons coming through: pole axes, bows, fighting poles, homicides with bare hands, or natural objects like sticks and stones. And we can also pick out some differences between the towns, which may shed light on the social and economic history of medieval London, York and Oxford. In York and Oxford, we see a prevalence of short knives, a cheap multi-purpose knife that men would carry on their belt for use in sort of everyday tasks, perhaps even for chopping up food. In contrast, in London, we see more long knives or daggers. Knives, but ones that are designed to cause harm, rather than ones that are being used as tools. But what can we learn about gender? So here I divided my analysis into two categories. So weapons that could be used as everyday items, things that we primarily think of as tools, though are not designed to hurt people. And then the other category being things that are weapons designed to cause harm. The first category, everyday items, will include things like walking staves, these small knives carried on a person's belt for everyday tasks and food preparation. Includes agricultural tools, axes that were used for wood cutting, and these natural objects like sticks or rocks. While these objects are clearly capable of killing, it was not their primary purpose. And the second category is actual weapons, swords, bows, battle axes, and knives designed to harm, such as daggers. And what is really striking here is that when we look at the female homicides, they all fall into this first category of everyday items. No woman indicted in any of the three cities was recorded as having something that we would think of as a weapon designed to kill. And this is an important finding. It could reflect real restrictions on medieval women's access to weapons that were designed to cause harm. Unlike men, women in the Middle Ages were not typically trained to use weapons from an early age and do not seem to have partaken regularly in hunting or quasi-military sports such as jousting or archery. Men, on the other hand, in medieval society, rather than being banned from owning weapons, they were required to own weapons in accordance to their status. Before modern policing or standing armies, everybody was responsible for keeping the peace. Therefore, everybody must possess, every man must possess arms in accordance with their wealth and their standing. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 outlined the weapons that every man between the ages of 15 and 60 were allowed and indeed expected to own in order to maintain the police, a role that women seem to have been excluded from entirely. However, it is still worth noting that the majority of male suspects were recorded as killing with everyday items. The difference is that they also used weapons. As well as spotting similarities between men and women, it can be just as well as spotting differences, it can be just as revealing to find similarities. In late medieval England, we can see the most common objects used to commit homicide were everyday tools such as staves, small knives, axes, hatchets. Tools were common for both men and women, as well as the details inflicted were also similar for male and female suspects. It has been argued that pre-modern women committed less murder because they lacked physical strength, because they lived in a world without firearms. However, the similarity in the objects and the wounds inflicted between men and women starts to call this argument into question. And you'll also notice that I haven't spoken about poison. This is because across all three towns, we haven't found a single example of poison being used. So the obsession with the female poisoner seems to be a much later phenomenon. So it is clear that gender is playing a role. Female suspects differed from lay and clerical male suspects. Women were more likely to be prosecuted alongside somebody else, a co-suspect, or prosecuted as an accomplice. This could be benevolent sexism, the jury not wanting to believe women were capable of violence. Or perhaps it was an internalized sexism. Women felt they weren't capable of acting alone and sought male assistance, either before or after the act, due to the patriarchal structure of their everyday lives. We have visited the claim that Sunday was the day of murder in medieval society. And yes, this is true for these three cities when looking at the data as a whole. We can see a spike on Sunday and the phenomenon of Saints Monday, where work was slower, shorter, and we had a holiday feel. However, this pattern does not appear for female violence. Female violence is not concentrated on Sunday. And it is also impossible to identify a spike on any other day. This could suggest that female labour was much more consistent throughout the week. And finally, all of the women that we saw were indicted with everyday items rather than weapons. And again, this is an important finding as it reflects the real restrictions on the ability of medieval women to access proper weapons that were designed to cause harm. So as women form a minority within homicide statistics, failing to analyse the data by gender leads to an erasure of women. It universalizes the male experience, and instead of talking about crime, what we end up talking about is male-perpetrated crime. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephanie. That was really fascinating. I mean, a number of things, real points to make one think. I mean, I just had not imagined there would be quite such striking differences. I mean, I knew from things I'd heard you say before that women form a very small proportion of perpetrators, but that their patterns are both sort of chronologically and in what they're generally doing was really, really interesting. It makes you think, you know, a woman's work is never done. Every day is the same day for a woman, whereas for men, oh, you know, it's a holiday, let's go out and beat somebody up. I had a range of questions, and I'm sure there are some piling up in the Q&A and in the chat. But I just wanted to, I mean, one thing that I find very interesting is, of course, because this is the 14th century, it's characteristic of the time that people's names are useful indicators of where they come from. I mean, you know, a century later, you can't say that John of York comes from York. But in the early 14th century, somebody called John of York, who's in London, might well be local. And of course, the other side is this doesn't really help us women if women have taken on their husbands' names. So I'm quite interested to know whether there are women who are not identified as wives and whether you can say anything about them. I mean, obviously we're taking a small number and we're reducing it even more, but I would be interested if you have any comments on that.
Yes, absolutely. So we have, the vast majority of women, as we would expect, are identified as wives, just in the way that we saw Isabella, wife of Nicholas. We have women identified as daughters, sort of in the same format, but daughter of whoever. I have a couple of women who have names in their own right, and perhaps they're married, perhaps they're single, perhaps they're the ones in London maybe performing a sort of a femme sole where they are married women, but they're allowed to trade and maintain some sort of legal separation from their husband. And I find these women really interesting where they have a name. They either sort of have a name in the way that a man would have a name, or they have this sort of locational name, sort of Isabel of York, for example.
That's very interesting. I can see the questions are piling up in the Q&A, so I'll hand over to Danny for the moment if you want to take that on. And
hi, thanks, Vanessa. Hi, everyone. I'm Danny. I'm one of the BLH trustees, and I'm going to be chairing the other part of a Q&A session tonight. And I can see, Vanessa, as you said, questions have piled up in the Q&A. Keep your questions coming there, and if you want to put that in the chat as well, that is also fine. But yeah, Stephanie, I'm going to read out some of the questions that we've got so far to you. So yeah, just to start, we've got a question from Sophie Michelle. Says, "Hi Stephanie, great talk. Are you able to differentiate between victim ages? I was wondering if there's any evidence of a skew towards women killing children rather than adults."
Unfortunately, ages is something we can't really get at, probably in this period, definitely in these records. The ages aren't recorded. Some, especially criminologists, try to do it by, as we were just talking about, for women, they are either identified as wife of or daughter of, trying to make some sort of comment that if somebody's recorded as daughter of, perhaps they're younger. But that doesn't always seem to work. And in fact, I've seen men who are definitely adult men still being recorded as son of somebody else. So it's almost impossible to get an age. I have one case of a child. It is a particularly gruesome murder. They are recorded as being 5 years old. And the fact that the jury in these very formulaic documents go out of their way to record that shows that they want to make a point of that. But that one is, there's a male suspect in that case, not a female suspect. So yeah, sort of no infanticide, no overrepresentation of women killing children as far as we can see.
Oh, thank you. And then we've got a couple of questions that I think actually link up quite well. So we've got one from Jude Rhodes, who's asked, are there any plans to look at the data for more places? So example, rural places. And then I feel like this is linked where Susan has asked, if you're interested in one particular murder, what other records would you look at? So I think that's quite similar actually in terms of kind of looking at the data, kind of seeing the overlap between the records and thinking, yeah, I suppose on that local level.
Yeah, absolutely. So to take the first question about expanding, during my PhD, I looked at Yorkshire. When I joined the Medival Murder Map team, it made sense to map the city of York, but I have collected 40 years worth of data for the entire county of Yorkshire, the 3 ridings and the city. So that is probably going to be my next focus. Vanessa has said that the Historic Towns Trust have a map of Hull, so that seems to be an obvious starting point for me. But I am very interested in picking up the rural as well. It's just a bit more of a challenge in mapping the rural. As you saw within the cities, we quite often get street names or we're placed near a church. It's very nice and visual and you can pinpoint it on a map. With the rural cases, the only thing you get is the name of the village. You can't do anything more granular than that. And sorry, what was the second question? To remind me, Danny, sorry.
That's all good. Go back to it. So Susan asked, if you were interested in one particular murder, what other records would you look at? And that I was thinking a little bit about that as you were speaking, because I know TNA have a really good source base, but I was thinking, if you're going into record officers and like local record authorities and stuff, like I am quite interested in that as well, kind of thinking about those overlap and how those different kind of record series are interrelated.
Good, yeah, absolutely. So for the late Middle Ages, if you're interested in following a homicide through, your best point is the coroner's rolls, which I talked about today. This is at the scene, local people. You're probably going to get the most detail in these sources, even though they're very, very short. And then the next place you go if you want to follow the murder through is if the suspect was arrested and if they were taken to the county jail. So in York, for example, that was York Castle. If they were imprisoned, there will be a trial. So the murder will come up in that again, and you get to see whether they were sentenced to death or whether they were pardoned or whether they are acquitted. You can look in some of the royal court records at TNA to see the records of pardon. Maybe they were pardoned for the homicide. People might show up in that. For the looking at the murder, that's probably it. But you can maybe try and trace people in other sources, in local sources, in sort of rural societies, in manorial court rolls, looking for people in the poll tax. So if you're sort of interested about finding who the people are, there are sort of some local sources that you can use for that.
Excellent, thank you. We've got some more questions in the Q&A as well, but I'll just read out a comment in the chat. So Jude Rhodes has said, thank you for the answer to my question. As I'm from Yorkshire, that sounds very interesting. And also, yeah, great talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we've got 4 more questions. I'm going to read out the question from Nigel Tringham. So he's asked, did most, perhaps all, female suspect murders take place in houses, so i.e. private spaces rather than in the open street?
Yeah, so that is really, really difficult for us to tell. The vast majority of the time, we don't know where it took place. So we will have this street name. So the one that I showed you in York was sort of in Finkel Street, but we have no idea whether that is out in the street or inside a private residence that happens to be on that street. The vast majority of cases don't go into that much detail. There are a couple that talk about being killed in the house, particularly people being killed in bed. And this seems to be what I was talking about, where the jury are including that extra information to convey that they think this is a really heinous killing. So sort of being killed at night in bed. The medieval jury are very uncomfortable about violence being conducted in this sort of sneaky, underhand way, rather than it being a fair fight out in the open. So occasionally we can see that, but it's not women. The vast majority of time, this is cases involving a male suspect and a male perpetrator. A male victim and a male suspect.
Excellent, cool. So we've got some more questions, which I'm going to read out. So Simon Garbett has said, thanks for an excellent presentation. And then asked, using clerics as a control, were there any findings relating to weapon types?
Were there anything? So I didn't find any clerics using bows and arrows, which seemed quite striking, because there were a lot of men using bows and arrows. Sometimes it's sort of read that this was an accident, that it was recorded as a felonious killing because they had killed somebody, and it still needs to, in the Middle Ages, still needs to go to trial. And there's no legal distinction in this period between murder and manslaughter. In other cases, there were no such mitigations given, and it was just that somebody shot somebody with a bow and arrow. But these were always laymen and not clerics. So something interesting there, perhaps clerics being of higher status, or maybe clerics not being required to practice with the bow and arrow, like lower status laymen would be.
Also got a question from Hayden Charlesworth, who's asked, does the use of everyday objects by female perpetrators suggest murder by spur of the moment rather than by a planned event?
Yeah, I think that is mostly a fair deduction that we can make. Both for men and women, the vast majority of male killers and all of the female killers used everyday objects. So I think that does point to the sort of the spontaneity of this homicide, that this was a hot-blooded, it was in the heat of the moment, the object was there. If you've got most of the population walking around with a knife on their belts, it's probably not surprising that we've got very high levels of violence, as we know, if we think about modern knife crime, if we think about the availability of guns in countries that allow that. We know that if you have a weapon, conflicts are much more likely to escalate and much more likely to turn fatal.
I've got another question, and Stephanie, you did mention during your talk you've not found records of poisoning by women, but I suppose this is more, kind of broader general question of from David Taylor of, were medieval coroners able to identify poisonings?
Yeah, so that is the thing. If somebody's got a knife stuck in their chest, it's far easier to identify that as a homicide rather than somebody who is poisoned. And the coroner may put that down to a natural death. And there's nothing that we can sort of really do to prove that. I mean, I did sort of start reading some of the natural deaths, trying to look for things that could be a homicide. But then you sort of get into the realms of trying to reinvestigate cases from hundreds of years ago with very little evidence. The main thing that I would say to that is, if we think back to Rome, people knew about poison, people knew the symptoms of it in the Roman Empire, and later on in the Victorian period, people become really obsessed with this idea of the female poisoner. So I thought that it was interesting that we're not seeing that in the Middle Ages.
Excellent. And yeah, Hayden has said, thanks very much for the answer to my question and for a very good talk. So lots of positive comments for you, Stephanie. And actually I'm going to give people a little bit more time if they want to pop questions in the Q&A, any comments or any additional questions in the chat. But kind of based off of what you were just saying, I was wondering, do you see, I know you're working on the medieval period on the 14th century, but and kind of thinking about expanding the work, are you going to dip at all into the 15th and 16th century? Like, do you see patterns of what kind of changes, or what is written about female perpetrators? I just wondered if you're thinking in terms of kind of a, I suppose, longer time period, and kind of what continuity of changes you see over time.
Yes, I am really, really interested in change over time. At the moment, I'm writing a book about homicide and capital punishment in 19th century Wales. So I've jumped sort of even further into the future. And I'm sort of taking my questions around gender and how women were presented into that time period, where obviously I have a lot more information to work with. I'm using newspaper sources. I can see sort of some of the same patterns, but I can also see a lot of the things that we either still think or exist sort of subconsciously in society today, these sort of things that we say about women and how they kill and how they behave, is present in those 19th century documents. But when you go back to the Middle Ages, that sort of gender stereotyping is not really coming through in the records. And today I've pulled out some of the differences between male and female perpetrators, but it is worth saying for the vast majority of this, if you look at the inquest and you covered up the name, you wouldn't know the gender. There's no sort of gendered language. There's no sort of narratives around how women are supposed to behave or how they've transgressed gender. That just doesn't appear in the 14th century. And I'd be really, really interested to follow that forward, as you said, a couple of centuries, where we start to have this real sort of legal, perhaps even social turn against women, with the rise of witchcraft allegations, the rise of indicting women for being scolds and gossips, sort of that Reformation period where things seem to get worse for women. So I'd be really interested in looking at female criminality in that period.
No, definitely. I'm putting it into that kind of, I guess, kind of social, cultural and political context, and seeing kind of what changes, particularly, yeah, in the language and how you can interpret that language. Oh, thanks, Stephanie. And you've got some more very positive comments in the chat. Leslie O'Connell Edwards says, thank you for a fascinating talk. Very similar from Pamela Marin. Excellent talk and very interesting. Thank you. And I can see that there aren't any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So I'm going to start kind of rounding things off and concluding. Stephanie, oh, sorry, another positive comment from Catherine Ryan. Really enjoyed the talk and looking forward to hearing more about medieval Yorkshire murders. So all really positive and great. And Stephanie, thank you so much for an absolutely brilliant talk and answering everyone's questions. And thank you so much to our audience for being here this evening and joining us to hear from the Historic Towns Trust partnership with BLH. Just one thing from me before we end the meeting. Do please join us for our AGM on the 16th of May. It's going to be great, and we're very excited to have a talk from John Chandler on decoding towns, how to write the history of unfashionable towns, which I'm sure that you're all really excited for as well. So yeah, see you at the AGM on the 16th of May. And again, Stephanie, a massive thank you from all of us at BLH and Historic Towns Trust.
Thank you very much.